So welcome to today's webinar on how to create a Windows 10 migration strategy. My name is Heinrich Pelser, so I'm one of the business consultants here at PowerON. So my role involves kind of very much helping clients sort of discover some of the benefits and capabilities within the Windows 10 stack, predominantly as well, looking at things like EMS and the System Center side of things, and effectively just helping clients kind of realize that Windows 10 journey. So you are part of session 3 this morning on how to design Windows 10 and leverage some of the new capabilities and benefits obviously that's going to bring your organization. So in session 1 you had my colleague Lee and Graham also talking about some of the upgrade readiness stuff, or the Windows 10 assessments as it's now known, to start looking and getting a sort of analytical view of your environment, quickly followed by our managing director and also one of the other business consultants within the business, Mr. Philip Mercer, around the application readiness framework for the real world. He also did some really nice stuff in there, sort of talking about a project management framework and a managed migration framework as well, and looking at all sort of good stuff within the application stacks. So obviously really important for the sort of ongoing functioning, initial functioning, and also then the ongoing management side of Windows 10 as well. So without the apps running properly on Windows 10, you really don't have a Windows 10 strategy or migration really fully in place. So today is all about looking at Windows 10, and as part of that, I wanted to kind of set the scene a little bit as to kind of the agenda for today. So apologies for the mad animation. I went a bit crazy, but then again, I've got carte blanche to do so. So the sort of overall side of things today is around sort of looking at the initial set of latest features. We won't necessarily be diving into sort of release features within the Windows 10 side of things for the autumn, sort of summer updates from 1903 or anything like that. We're more looking at some of the enterprise features, what they are, so what version of Windows 10 you have. So you've got a couple that obviously to think about there. The first one being things like Windows 10 Pro. You've also then got Windows 10 workstations as well. There's obviously then the Windows 10 Enterprise stack, and then specifically within the Enterprise stack, they're obviously broken down into sort of two components, one being E3 and E5. And we'll also dive into what those actually mean, what they are going to give you, and also help sort of look at some of the design components that we here at PowerON strive to obviously implement for clients to make sure that they get the best out of their initial Windows 10 adoption, as well as the ongoing delivery of that operating system as well, right? Following on from that, we'll be looking at, for example, some of the bits and pieces around Windows 10, what's included in that as well. So from a licensing perspective, you might find yourself in a precarious situation where you have to make a decision around, for example, connectivity, VPNs and so forth, looking at what AlwaysOn has to offer as part of that. Also do my best to make sure that we keep in mind things like financial benefits and what you should be thinking about. So we'll help to sort of paint a picture of not just what's included, but what you need to consider for the sort of short, medium, and long term side of things, obviously with, you know, sort of Windows 10 being a big change adopted by organizations as well. And then we'll be sort of diving in more earlier into some of the image standards and bits and pieces to consider from a design perspective, with obviously the inclusion of things like Defender and Bitlocker management predominantly. So without further ado, on the Windows 10 side, a good question is, well, what is within it? What is it made of, right? What's the sort of meat and bones within it? And a good analogy that I've always stolen from one of the other sort of consultants here is a guy called Ken Caban, and he refers to, you know, likes to use his kitchen analogies, for example, right? I think it's a very good way of looking at your Windows 10 environment, especially from an early adoption perspective, in terms of how a kitchen runs. There's a lot of prep work that needs to happen. You have people in charge, people that kind of do some of the lesser stuff, the more important stuff, and the really important stuff, and obviously those things are relative within any given organization. But without a cohesive team, Windows 10 build strategy, build components, leveraging the right types of technology to obviously meet the business needs, things very quickly become disjointed, as opposed to like a sort of chef's kitchen or restaurant kitchen. Once those things aren't in sync, they have an impact in the front of house. In that instance, it would be obviously your business users, for example, so people that you support and enable through your IT services. So without one helping the other, it can be sort of hard to manage, because there's always a certain level of expectation from IT, as there would be from a kitchen staff, obviously to provide the best service possible, obviously, and also good value for money, more than important as well, right? So we'll be looking at some of the Windows 10 features, I said, predominantly around sort of Enterprise and Pro stack and what that means. I'll also try my best to walk you guys through, for example, what a good design means as well. So there's some real basic components in there which we'll walk through to sort of look at, okay, you know, here's the sort of starting blocks, and here's some of the fundamentals to look at as part of your Windows 10 journey. And then we'll couple those into an interwoven approach with things like BitLocker management and also Windows Defender. So without further ado, let me show you guys what's inside the Windows 10 side of things. So let's look at the comparisons and obviously the Windows 10 editions available today, right? So the first one being is going to be the Windows 10 Pro for workstations. This is very much geared towards very advanced users, right? We're seeing it adopted in things like the media industry, real heavy users of this sort of operating system would include things like sort of data scientists, people who do sort of real hardcore video editing and sort of data analysis would definitely be sort of looking to use this, and also very much aimed at the scientific community as well, and some of the stuff that it can do. So it's a really, really cool offering for that. The Windows 10 Pro, again, a good all-rounder, all right, for obviously enterprise organizations alike. So you could find a split within that, depending on what your needs are. And obviously the enterprise version of Windows 10, which comes in those two sort of like flavors, the E3 and the E5, which we'll obviously cover as part of it as well, right? There are some important considerations to think about when you're adopting or sort of looking to take this on. The first one being things like, for example, Defender and Application Guard, right? So this effectively prevents malware and hacking threats. You know, should you be using things like Edge and so forth. So there's some good capabilities built into the operating system on the enterprise front, not included in things like the Pro versions, of course, right? The other thing there is around things like Defender, Application Control. Really, really nice tool for enterprise guys to have these days. So effectively it's the capability to obviously restrict, sort of limit the sort of number of applications or types of applications that are obviously running within your environment as well, right? So you can sort of effectively create a list of trusted apps and they can execute on your Windows environment. So obviously giving you some really, really nice control. The other thing to then think about and bear in mind is an EMS component, so something that you might wish to look at if you really want to sort of dive in a sort of extra mile into the sort of security landscape this days, which is ever widening from a Microsoft perspective, would be to sort of consider things like advanced threat protection. So ATP, sort of really good name, integrates really, really nicely with some of the existing stuff you get within your Windows 10 Enterprise platform, mainly things like Defender, and it's very much geared towards things like post-breach detection, right? So one thing you'll see from Microsoft, and a message they were sending, is to always assume that you are breached or have been breached. So always be on alert, always be on the back foot, actively looking for things. And that sort of security offering there is really only available for this sort of enterprise stack in terms of the Windows 10 offering sets. Another really important component as well, you'll see this creeping into organizations more and more. You may already have sort of one sort of toe dipped into the pool for things like Windows Analytics, if you want to look at all the Windows 10 assessments as they're now known, to start sort of making some decisions based on data, right? The idea here is, for example, there are effectively these 1, 2, 3 components here that are very sort of analytical driven. The first one being, for example, desktop analytics. We're going to see sort of massive adoption for that. So that effectively provides you with real powerful insights into what your environment is doing, what it's happening. You know, for example, you can feed all the data back into the cloud for you to monitor as well and look at, for example, things like your deployment progress, which is a big thing, right? The other thing there is around desktop analytics and update compliance. It gives you the ability to monitor the deployment of compliance status across all updates, right? Really, really nice cloud capability to have. So, you know, I would always recommend, and one thing I always ask for, is, you know, so for IT to be able to slide a report or email a report over to the IT director or the head of IT to sort of say, you know, here's the compliance, you know, and all of that is, for example, data driven from the cloud. And then obviously the sort of last component here, you can effectively sort of identify some systematic stuff that's impacting users and remediate them, right? So you start looking at your Windows 10 environment in sort of a health context, you know, so there can be certain components or certain areas of the organization that are weaning or sick, for example, and this gives IT professionals the capability of obviously remedying that. Now, doesn't mean to say that when Windows 10 Pro has no capability such as that. There are obviously other tools that can monitor and look at your environment, but built-in wise, this is really only included in the enterprise stack from a Windows 10 perspective as well, right? And a biggie to call out here is this one here. So this is the 13-month support for September targeted releases. So what does that mean, right? So obviously when you are looking to obviously adopt Windows 10, not because you want to, you really have to now if you're a Windows 7 customer, you are looking at obviously upgrading sequentially your Windows 10 environment, right? So you have that numbers game that you're playing at the moment. So you can be on a 09 release or an 03 release of something like Windows 10. And if you're an enterprise customer, you can now, for example, have extended support on that for 30 months. So if you're on an 09 release of Windows 10, Microsoft will give you 30 months to stay on that version. So obviously then look to upgrade within that time frame. Naturally, the recommendation would be don't wait to month 29 before you move across. That in itself can have some impacts. You will see obviously that being a bit of a security hole to fill, but it is a really, really nice sort of reliever of the stress, because obviously that Windows 10 side of things is obviously ever evolving, which we'll cover as well in the sort of the design components. And then towards the tail end there is the LTSC access, right? So that's the long-term servicing channel. A good way of thinking that is as a good replacement for things like Windows Embedded, maybe, if anyone's ever kind of dealt with that or sort of needs something like that within their organization, to sort of single-purpose devices, right? So if a device needs Office, you probably wouldn't recommend something like LTSC. But again, that's more slanted towards the enterprise end of the Windows 10 world, right? Cloud activation. So this is a really nice capability. So the idea here is that if you are on Pro and you hold enterprise licensing, you can effectively upgrade those devices automatically from the cloud, right? So you can, for example, upgrade someone or push them up a version as part of your, if you're purchasing OEM devices, maybe you can look to obviously bolster those and move them up towards an enterprise. So there's no real reason to remove the binaries of Windows 10 anymore to then effectively put them back on as we used to do in the old days. So a really nice sort of feature to have there as well, right? We can manage things like user experiences, right? So this is a sort of strong one to consider within enterprise environment, especially around things like obviously the store access. You can, for example, put advertisements on the start menu and the taskbar, and also you can leverage Cortana to obviously feed information into the organization as well. A nice to have, really kind of positive user end feature set that may be worthwhile adopting. It doesn't necessarily have a massive bearing when you're purchasing of that side of things, but it's definitely one to think about overall. And again, here, for example, things like user rights, virtual desktop rights around, for example, the VDI side of things or the Windows 10 VDI side of things. So if you are looking at, for example, adopting that particular technology set, you would need to purchase the enterprise side of things. And then obviously the last two to mention here, things like UEV, so we can obviously enable certain sort of end user virtualization capabilities in terms of profile management, some of those bits and pieces to be considered. That is again an enterprise feature, and AppV native within the enterprise stack. Finally, right? So that's obviously a massive positive. In terms of some of the enhanced productivity stuff, right here, sort of more geared towards some of the real geeky side of side of the fence, so you can sort of do some stuff from a sort of device perspective around real intensive apps again, and then obviously the SMB side of things is also supported primarily just within the enterprise stack as well. Everything else from a productivity perspective, Microsoft have got some really, really good coverage across this, right? So they've made sure that, from a productivity perspective, you've got all the sort of basics, all the nice to haves as part of that. So Cortana's in there, Edge is in there, Office 365 capabilities across the board is in there as well. More around performance in terms of the persistent memory and SMB side of things. They're leaning towards the pro workstations because they have this heavy demand on workloads, and as well then more towards the enterprise stack as well, right? So something definitely to consider in terms of the adoption. But Windows Inc., OneNote, all those type of things is included within here, right? So to help answer that question around the E3 and E5 side of things, there is a full comparison which I'll show you now. So here we are. This is the sort of full comparison table, and as you'll see here to the top right, you have Windows 10 E3, and again the E5 side of things when it comes to the sort of enterprise versions of Windows 10. Now there are some key considerations to have as part of this. Again, a lot of this stuff is based around the security side more than anything else, but I just think it's worthwhile understanding effectively why you may want one over the other from an implementation perspective, obviously a business driver perspective as well as maybe sort of plugging some of the security needs that you have. But a lot of the settings here are sort of security related, and those are typically the difference between E3 and the E5 side of things from an enterprise level, right? You can see here sort of initially around the threat protection side of things with Windows Defender, Advanced Threat Protection, for example, things like customizable, allow and deny URL and IP lists and certificates and so forth, more towards the E5 stuff as well. And if you need to sort of carry any, for example, device-based sort of conditional access controls, again, you'd need to be on the E5 side of, on the E5 stack of that. So, you know, you have to sort of be more towards the upper echelons of that particular Windows 10 offering as well, right? Some of the other things to sort of consider here again, which are only E5 features, not included in E3. So you can look at things, for example, like some tamper protection or tamper controls around the operating system as well. And again here, again pointing more towards sort of the security angle here, which you'll see is around things like advanced machine learning and some of the AI stuff. Again, sort of real heavy security offerings, real kind of deep granular levels of security is more towards the E5 side of things as well. And again, emergency outbreak protection, intelligence security graphs and all that type of things are sort of more slanted towards the E5 side entirely. So if you are an organization or you are considering to sort of adopt a much more heavier kind of security footprint, the E5 suite may definitely be something you want to consider as well. And there are some feature sets here that are solely only available for the E5 stack as well. And these again are listed here around, for example, the endpoint detection, sort of some of the response bits and pieces you can do as well, right? So there's things like forensic collections, so real deep dive stuff, post-breach stuff again as well, right? Mentioned at the top here around, for example, behavioral-based detection for advanced targeting threats, again, more sort of stacked towards the ATP side of things, as we mentioned earlier as well, again as well. So take a screenshot of this. Obviously, you'll have access to the videos and stuff going forward as well, but from an E5 perspective, it's again very sort of heavily linked into the security footprint. So the overall functionality across the board is really, really good. And again, you'll see here automatic investigation, remediation, again, a big thing for big enterprises who want to automate as much of the security process as possible. You can start to look to do that around automation of advanced threats, automation, for example, around some of your analytics and reporting as well. So you can really start getting some really good constant flows of data as to what's happening to your Windows environment from a security angle as well, right? And again, finally, we'll sort of just tie this off here around some of the security management stuff. Again, you'll see that, for example, rich Power BI dashboards, reporting, monitoring, analytical reporting, again, solely towards the E5 side of the fence as well. And then from an inbuilt perspective, you'll see that it's got some good capabilities in there around, for example, the ISO 27001 compliance perspective, fully supported within the E5 stack as well as then, for example, all of these other bits and pieces within here. So Open Graph APIs to integrate with your solutions as well might be a big thing if you have inbuilt apps or sort of bespoke things you need to cater for. The E5 thing, the E5 version of Windows 10 will be sort of better suited to you and your business. So now that we've had a good look at the feature comparisons between things like Windows 10, what's included from an enterprise stack and a pro stack and everything else, I thought it might be a good idea to start painting a bit of a picture as to what we're used to as IT professionals, you know, sort of in the way that we do projects. So initially we have XP here, we have Windows 7 here, and finally we have Windows 10. You're going to have to excuse my poor drawing. And then we have to deal with things like levels of effort and fundamentally disruption, right? And in between here we have, for example, these timelines. Each one of them would last around the sort of 5-year mark. So a good way of thinking about this, obviously when you went from something like NT to XP, the initial levels of effort were quite high, and then IT did nothing for 5 years, for example, right? Again, with Windows 7, the levels of effort were huge, right? So going from XP to 7 in itself was a huge undertaking for IT departments, and most organizations have maybe upgraded to, for example, something like SP1 for Windows 7, but have fundamentally just waited until the next version of the operating system has arrived. That back then, I suppose, was things like Windows 8, which was adopted by some organizations, but didn't really have the sort of full swing that something like Windows 10 has, right? So what you're going to see again, for example, is the levels of effort spike again within your Windows 10 a sort of adoption, but off the back of that, IT no longer has the capability to do nothing, all right? You are going to have to start thinking about an increasing level of disruption over a long period of time to end users, because this bit here fundamentally is going to be things like feature updates, right? And you can sort of already sort of see where that word's going if you're a bit witty, for example, right? But ultimately speaking, that is definitely something to consider around how that process is going to change and what that really does mean for IT departments, right? So over a longer period of time, you are going to have to start introducing an increasing level of change to the environment and to your staff, right? So it is definitely something to really cater for in the early stages around expectation settings, really getting buy-in from the business that this is something that you're going to have to do. And from an IT perspective, also look at managing it as well, right? So following on from this, I just wanted to sort of break down some of the core fundamentals in the way in which we approach a design. So now that we've looked at that process around how IT is going to have to adapt and change with that Windows 10 adoption in terms of more process management side of things and turning that project traditional motion of waiting into something else, let's look at, for example, now the sort of 5 key components in rendering a Windows design, right? So these 5 boxes, right? So we've got 1, we've got 2, we've got 3, we've got 4, and we have 5 there, right? So to break these down into their sort of respective bits and pieces to consider from a design perspective, right? Fundamentally, some of the stuff we're trying to cater for here is the stack, right? So everything that we need to think about as both the business as well as IT professionals in needing to deliver to our end users, right? So the first thing we need to consider within the design exercise, once we get to this stage, is, for example, things like the user settings, right? Now, the reason I'm typing out here is because my handwriting overall has been fairly flaunt and terrible, but I just wanted to effectively really just paint the picture as to what all these components exist of. Following on from that, one of the big considerations, again, that we need to take is around applications, right? The application sets that we deliver to the business are going to be key and fundamental, because without the sort of applications functioning in the way that we need them to function, we don't really have a Windows 10 environment, because the Windows 10 environment is useless if the business applications we're trying to execute against are non-functional as well, right? And in terms of the application side of things, that can be broken down into maybe some additional components as well to think about from a sort of design exercise, as well as a sort of adoption exercise as well, right? Because these could be things like individual applications. So which application is needed by a specific individual. Role-based app, so tax-wide app or service-wide app might be considered as well as part of that. And then, for example, your enterprise app and some of the sort of office apps and everything else obviously fall into that mixed line of business applications are also included, right? And obviously the other big one is around the security front, right? So we discussed those bits and pieces earlier around the E3 and the E5 side of things. So actually putting these into play is going to be a big decision that has to be taken, right? It's one of the core fundamentals of the Windows 10 approach, not just in terms of keeping the end user safe and secure, but also business assets, mainly things like documentation, right? Standards, sort of certifications that needs to be adhered to, ISO standards, whatever the case may be. All of those bits and pieces are considered within the footprint, right? And then when we're breaking it down to obviously the sort of bare bones and brass tacks of what we do, we are going to need hardware to obviously run this on, right? And not just hardware, we're also going to need, for example, additional software, and mainly from an IT perspective as well, things like drivers, right? All of these things are going to be sort of critical components in us being able to run Windows 10 on supported hardware devices. Without that, again, you're in a position where you are in an unsecure environment again, or a sort of environment that's not supported, right? So again, a real big thing to consider there. And a lot of this happens earlier on. You would have seen, for example, Lee talk about in the initial webinar around his adoption around those Windows Analytics, Windows 10 assessment pieces to really help support that. And again, the last one here is obviously deciding the OS or the operating system, what they were going to run, the versioning of that. Remember, right, that's not just E3 or E5 anymore or Pro, it's also the version we're going to take forward into the business. So from a design aspect, these are the critical components that we expand on over a period of time, obviously through things like design workshops, assessments and planning to effectively create everything, and that in itself defines your Windows 10 image, or at the very least the sort of desktop stack at the very least as well, right? Ultimately speaking, there's other core components you would look to approach in a modular fashion. There is a reason these things are modular, is so that obviously if a single setting change or a single application set has to change, we can make one change across the board from a centrally managed location that can take effect business-wide. The same is true for things like application sets, centrally managing those application sets, and for things like security, is a big consideration, because if that doesn't happen and it happens in isolation, you could have things very quickly fall out of sync. So again, very critical and very important to, for example, the ongoing management of Windows 10. And getting this wrong is also really, really expensive for businesses. You can spend a lot of time overthinking things, which is something that we see a lot, over-engineering certain components and aspects, and I suppose not planning for the future. That will then again leverage high amounts of sort of consultancy support over a period of time, high utilization of support staff, not focusing on BAU activities as well, and a sort of increased project timeline overall. So let's have a quick look at the Windows Defender side of things as well, and where that sits within this. So when it comes to the Windows Defender side of things, right, what you saw over a period of time as this product set developed was that it was never really sort of Microsoft's focus during the Windows 7 days, Windows 8 days, and so on, but they've made ever-increasing strides, right? So this particular article, written by the guys at Panda, I think sort of really sort of illustrates the feeling of Windows Defender in the sort of recent memory as well. So this particular study was done in 2017, and highlighted there in yellow is, as you can see in the middle of the fence there, obviously where Windows Defender used to sit, right, from a sort of comparative perspective across 17 other major antivirus solutions, right? So at the time, yes, you were well within your rights to kind of look towards different security measures as well, but over time Microsoft has done themselves some justice. They've really invested heavily within this product set, and going forward, this same report has now changed, which is displayed here. So as you can see, a similar study was again conducted the following year, right, where Microsoft have made sort of real strides in actually kind of bolstering their security offering from a Defender aspect. So the reason I included these particular articles is to show a different type of source in terms of obviously the aspects to consider when you're looking to adopt Windows Defender, because it doesn't just have immediate impact in terms of being something that is already on the sort of device, right? It's already there. You know, you don't have to think about it from a Microsoft standpoint. They're saying, look, it's already included, right? And I suppose security vendors and teams looked at this and sort of said, well, this is what they're bad at. This is the gap, right? This is the plug that we need to fill. So over a period of time, with the heavier levels of investment, the following year, they've changed minds, right? And as you can see here, as part of this graph here, that same study that was conducted the following year proved that Microsoft, for example, were able to block at 100% some of the sort of naughtiness that resides out there on the internet as well, right? And I think there's a very telling clip, which I'll play next, from Brad Anderson, and he refers to, for example, things as seams, right? And I very much agree with him around that approach. Not always agree with him, but I think he does make a good point. So I'll quickly play that clip just to provide some additional context around the considerations for needing to adopt something like Windows Defender, not just as a cost-saving measure, but also a real viable sort of security consideration when it comes to sort of IT decision makers having to think about, what do I need to do next in terms of my security landscape, and what do I use as my offering to the business from an antivirus perspective. So let's just take a moment just to quickly listen to Brad on this one.
You know, many of you may have deployed competitors over the past couple of years, and you know what, you probably made the right decision when you made that decision 2 or 3 years ago. You know, state of the art back then was these independent solutions that were working, you know, in a very specific area, addressing a very specific need. I can guarantee you that the attackers that you're trying to protect against are looking for seams. And if you have multiple solutions that are acting and operating completely independent of each other, you have seams. With enterprise mobility and security and Office 365 and Windows 10, you have an engineered solution that has been built and engineered to give you a comprehensive way to think about enterprise mobility and security in a way that's working together and eliminates those seams. So as you use enterprise mobility and security, you are more secure. We also do it at a far lower cost. It's amazing to me how often I'll walk into an organization and they've deployed, you know, an MDM solution and an identity protection solution and a data protection solution, and the list goes on and on. Every one of those is a subscription or it's an on-prem service that you have to build and maintain, and it's cost. It's remarkable how often as organizations look at enterprise mobility and security, they can take out 60–70% of their costs because they have an integrated suite, an integrated set of capabilities at one price.
So just to recap the messaging from Brad Anderson on that front is something that over a period of time I have come to agree with. I think the sort of investment that they've made, sort of currently speaking around things like Windows Defender, is now a viable solution, right? And if you have an existing antivirus software or service that you are looking to renew, you may have to sort of stop and think. Sort of these days, based on some of the evidence out there, I do agree that from a security perspective, these seams is where things are being attacked, and things are being really scrutinized these days within sort of businesses. And on the flip side of that, it does make sort of logical sense to use Microsoft stuff for Microsoft purposes. Leveraging what you already have from a cost-saving perspective is a viable solution these days, or a viable option at the very least, including things like Defender. Now, sort of granted, some of the points there were made around the EM&S side, but I think the sort of methodology and what he was talking about does ring true. So let's take a step to one side now and also talk about things like Bitlocker, right? So depending on the licensing you may have, lots of you may have access to things like the MDOP suite or some of the encryption capabilities you have within that as well, right? And sort of leveraging that native capability does sort of stand you in good stead. So let's take a moment now to look at, one side to the left of that. Would be things like, the encryption layer. So Bitlocker specifically, right? So if you pretend that this is your device, right? And as part of this device, you have encryption, right? So, you have a hard disk here that you are looking to obviously secure and encrypt over a period of time. As part of that encryption process, you generate a key, right? Now that key from a Bitlocker perspective can go a sort of multitude of directions, right? The sort of typical one being, if you do it by hand, you can print the key, you can store it in OneDrive as well, should you need to as well, or you can, for example, save it locally on the disk. Right now, that isn't sort of a smart thing to do, right? So as part of that, there are some solutions Microsoft have offered, right? The initial one here to the sort of right-hand side, right, would be the MBAM solution, so the Microsoft BitLocker and administration, pardon the handwriting. But ultimately speaking, that provides enterprise organizations with the capability of taking that security key, right, from a device during a build process, right, and putting it into a SQL database, right? So the MBAM solution is very much an on-premise side of things, and that, for example, splits the attack vector as well. So you don't have the keys in the same place as the device and so forth. So should someone take the hard drive out, there is a good answer, a sort of good security measure in place to make sure that obviously nothing happens, right? Another typical one, right, that we see a lot of organizations use these days is they take that key and they put it into Active Directory, right? So you can put that key straight into Active Directory as well, right? Now that key will then reside under the computer object, specifically within the Active Directory stack as well. So there's a couple of roles you have to install and so on. The issue with that is that the assumption is that obviously certain local administrators and people will have access to Active Directory, right? And they will also then have access to those keys, right? So in response to that, the actual solutions themselves have adopted over time. So you have some additional options to consider from an encryption perspective as to what you do with that key, right? The sort of initial one, right, as well, is you can now put that within the cloud, right? So you can put that within Azure now. You can use Intune as well, which is again sort of product to the side and part of that EM&S stack that we mentioned earlier to cater for key management as well. And I suppose the future to sort of trajectory for this would be SCCM, right? So you can now start looking in the future releases of SCCM. It's not available yet, unfortunately, to start putting those keys and managing your BitLocker environment from a central location, right? With SCCM being, the one everyone's really been waiting for. BitLocker and everything else can be managed from a multitude of sources. You have to pick the best one for you, right? We're seeing a lot of sort of public sector clients, specifically around things that we work with a lot around the NHS, leveraging MBAM because it's part of the E5 licensing for sort of their central agreement that they have. So we're seeing a lot of work and focus around that. We're also seeing a lot of clients waiting for this one around the SCCM side of things, right? Intune is one that's also being steadily adopted, and we are seeing a sort of slow decrease around the Active Directory side of things just because there are better, more secure solutions available as part of that. So from a holistic security perspective, you do have some really nice options now to consider. Some of the inbuilt capabilities, right? We've not really covered anything else from an enterprise security side of things, things like application guard or device guard, but fundamentally they would make up from that previous sort of set of slides we showed, that sort of drawing we did around the security side of things, when considering those core components, they would also factor into the mix here. But ultimately speaking, the defender conversation needs to happen within IT departments at a rate of knots to help make that money decision around, do we keep Kaspersky or Panda or Symantec or Sophos? You have a wide range of conversations to have now. I suppose the challenges there comes with bolt-on services that sort of tends to be provided from those vendors. Some of them good, some of them bad. I suppose it's more of a sort of business-led decision that needs to be made on that front. But from an encryption perspective, the recommendation is strongly to sort of stick around, this side of the fence and leverage some of the native capabilities for ease of use, mainly, right? Peace of mind as well, because all of these are vetted and they obviously do work, with the exception of the SC symbol. We can't vouch for that yet, it's not out yet. But sort of in preview, it seems to be quite successful as well. And then overall, from a management perspective, keeping centralized access and controls over your BitLocker environment for device encryption is going to be critical. Now, one thing to bear in mind, one of the nicer things to consider as well around the MBAM side of things is self-service of these keys. So you can, for example, make these available to end users on demand should you require to do so. So from a Windows 10 perspective, just to quickly recap, we've looked at the feature sets available within that stack, right? From an E3 perspective, from an E5 perspective, from a Pro perspective, we've covered all of those, so you know what's in all of those now. We've then also sort of taken a leap into the full comparison versus E3 and E5 from an enterprise perspective as well. Again, E5 leaning far more towards that security push that we're seeing sort of Microsoft heavily investing in at the moment. Not viable for all organizations, right? It may be overkill. You may have no capacity to even cater and deliver for it. But it's definitely something to consider, when you are making those sort of initial purchasing decisions or adoption decisions in the near future or currently. You may sort of change your trajectory and obviously look to adopt those. And following on from that, we looked at those core components that make up that stack of sort of services and bits and pieces we have to provide to the business that holistically make up our sort of image deployment. All right, and that can come from a few places. And on the side of that, we looked at some of the existing investments you can re-leverage or leverage solely now. Things like Defender is a big one to consider. Always On is something we'll touch on next, right, as well from a VPN perspective. And then again, looking at that encryption side of things, right, that device encryption. The main thing we're stopping there with device encryption is sometimes hard to, well, why am I encrypting this device? If someone takes the hard drive out of that device, puts it into a caddy or a mount, they should not be able to access it if they do not have the security key. The security key itself and how that's managed can be quite critical because, as we all know, with the best intentions in the world, sometimes data can reside on disks, right? And it's also an extra security measure that the device get stolen, for example, as well. So there are some key considerations from a design perspective, an implementation perspective that we have to think about, as well as in the wider overarching piece around the version and type of Windows 10 we need to consider that makes it right for our business. So let's quickly jump into the always on side of things as well, just to suppose complete the picture and then sort of also draw towards the conclusion of this webinar. So always on VPN for Windows 10, right? It's I suppose sort of good place to start is what is it? What's it for? And what does it do? Right? I suppose just maybe take a step back as well as to kind of discuss or just to kind of recap on the purpose of a VPN, a virtual private network, the fundamentals of why enterprise organizations have these sets of technologies at their disposal, or VPNs at their disposal, is to effectively provide the end user a way of accessing stuff back on premise, right, if they're out and about or not within a given network or trusted network as well, right? So it will mimic an environment that is relevantly sort of closely related to your work environment, therefore allowing you to have access to central files and storages and so forth as well, right? Always on VPN is named thusly because it is always on, right? The sort of main thing for it would be to sustain a connection when you're out and about to your on-premise systems, right? Hence the sort of terminology and why they called it always on, right? It's built on top of sort of existing solution as well, referred to as direct access, again offering direct access in a similar way that AlwaysOn sort of access obviously provides access back into the sort of environment as well. But they have made some really nice sort of improvements and sort of leverage some additional capabilities as well. This would be really sort of helpful for IT departments as well, right? So, you know, some of the nice features to obviously consider as part of that is, you know, you can effectively look to sort of remotely manage these clients when they're out and about as well, right? Because this sort of remote computer is turned on and the internet is connected, it's always available to manage, right? Which is a really nice thing for IT, something we've always struggled with, right? Because with some solutions, you were required to log on to your VPN solution, right? So you'd have a RAS token, or you'd also have maybe sort of a app on the phone, and you would have to log on to it with something like AlwaysOn. That's mitigated by things like conditional access and Azure AD and so on, with multi-factor authentication. But effectively, you would never have to log on to access your core and key services, things like email and access to sort of file shares and home drives and so on, right? So it is a nice solution to have in that respect, because it does offer IT quite a lot of control, right? Some of the other bits and pieces to consider about this as well is that AlwaysOn supports non-enterprise Windows 10 client SKUs. So should you need to, it can work on Home and Pro as well, right? So it's quite dynamic in that respect as well. It also sort of does a really good job of supporting granular control across your network, right, or sort of access to sort of bits and pieces on the network. And one of the big limitations with its predecessor was the sort of hard requirement to only work on something referred to as IPv6. So it's an IP protocol technology that can be in itself quite cumbersome and complicated at times. So with the introduction of something like AlwaysOn VPN, that's been sort of reduced in complexity, because now also offers more traditional management around things like IPv4 as well. And the AlwaysOn infrastructure as well is something Microsoft have spent a lot of time developing. So it's referred to as infrastructure independence, right? So it can support for effectively, you know, devices across the sort of breadth of supply. So you can leverage things like Cisco devices, Checkpoints, Juniper, Palo Alto, SonicWall, I think Sophos, and some other ones as well. So you can be quite dynamic in terms of that networking kit that you have to repurpose that to obviously, you know, go ahead and leverage this particular sort of service as well. From a cost perspective, all right, putting it in is an affordable exercise, right? It's not the biggest project in the world. It's a sort of concise and very sort of like, you know, straightforward process from a PowerON delivery perspective. The ongoing management costs of it are minimal, right? They would fall under sort of traditional and standard maintenance procedures you have with your current server environment, because remember, this is a big thing. The AlwaysOn implementation side of things at this point in time, so the 2nd of August 2019, is not supported within Azure. Doesn't mean it doesn't work, it just means not supported. So those things can mean different things to different people, but there's definitely a strong consideration to be made. If you're more cloud-centric, you may wish to look at alternative solutions for anything you may have currently on premises, if your, you know, sort of current trajectory doesn't allow you to sort of leverage a traditional VPN solution as well, right? And then the ongoing benefits of that. There's no renewal. It's part of your sort of licensing queues a lot of the time, right? So there's a sort of cost benefit to be had in that alone. There's lots of organizations who, by the sort of mere fact of reducing or mitigating or sort of removing entirely things like RAS tokens, are able to pay for and have some money left over for other projects, right? You don't have to have the sequential renewal, right? It's a fairly robust solution, works really, really well with Windows 10 and Windows 10 only. So that's also something to consider as well, right? So you may find yourself having a bit of a split brain environment depending on how your migration is going or what you're looking at doing as well, right? So ultimately speaking, as I said, the sort of core fundamentals of that is for IT departments to consider where they want to go with their VPN. Are they licensed for AlwaysOn? Should they be using it for Windows 10? Absolutely should. All right. The agent itself. So in the past, you have to deploy an agent to a device. That's a thing of the past now. It's built into the operating system from a Microsoft perspective. You know, other providers may vary. But from an ease of management perspective, it's a really, really nice addition to sort of tool belt, if you want to call it that, of IT departments overall. So just to kind of recap everything we've spoken about so far in this webinar so far, we've obviously dived into the Windows 10 side of things, fundamentally looking at the feature sets, the capabilities, some of the areas and sort of buttons you need to consider and what's going to be right for your organization across that sort of sort of pro and enterprise stack of technologies as well. We've looked at some of the core fundamental design aspects we need to cover, or that we do cover as a business here at PowerON, to cater for user settings, device into applications, all those interlocking components that make up the holistic picture of the Windows 10 image as well. We've also then talked about things like Defender and where that fits now. We looked at a couple of sources that showed us some conflicting information, how Microsoft have made that transition into a more positive step, as well as also then sort of touched on the BitLocker side of things. Really key components, right? So you've got some really nice options these days that are built into the operating system to really support and bolster, that physical security that can sometimes be lacking or an afterthought a lot of the times. And then from a VPN and a connectivity perspective, something like AlwaysOn is a really strong candidate to be used by businesses these days to make sure that there's no renewals as part of it. Licensing renewals are obviously an obvious one, but no service renewals, right? And it's something that's fully supported and integrated into current systems and environments these days, and caters for a wide array of user scenarios, both cloud-based as well as an on-premise based or sort of traditional Windows 10 management as well. So thank you very much for obviously attending the webinar. Obviously, thank you for listening. If you have any questions or anything like that you want to talk to us about, we have a website. It's PowerOnPlatforms.com for some sort of generic information, whatever the case may be. Or if you have some specific questions, or if you want to discuss anything in further detail, or find out about any of the services or some of the stuff we've considered or sort of spoken about within here, then info@PowerOn Platforms is the email address to send your questions to. The following sessions will be released in the coming months, so please stay tuned for those. I've been Heinrich Pelser, and thank you very much for your time.